Hey folks, Randy Newberg here with another episode of Loophold's Hunt Talk Radio. Randy Newberg Unfiltered, which I don't think we got to go real unfiltered today. We have a repeat guest. I think this will be his fourth appearance on our podcast. Down here at the SHOT Show in Lost Wages, Nevada. And was lucky to carve away a little time between some really, really crazy meeting schedules that this guest has. He's in very high demand. And my own crazy schedule while I'm here at SHOT Show. When we get this thing in the full-blown mode, you're going to get to hear some really cool perspectives and updates from Shane Mahoney. Shane is, he's many things. I'll just call him the leading voice of conservation of our time about hunting as it, fits into society, hunting and how it's viewed by society, and how all the things we do are somehow affecting conservation of wild places and wild things. So, before we get to that, I want to quickly thank Leupold for being the title sponsor of this podcast. Very, very grateful for the support they give us in everything we do. They not only make great optics, but they are huge supporters of self-guided hunting, of any hunting, no matter what kind of hunting, and of the public land conservation story we always tell. Go to leupold.com. Here at the SHOT Show, they are rolling out some really, really cool items. This morning, I stopped by the booth, and they had the new BX5 binoculars for me. Ooh, man, I am heading to Arizona tomorrow to give those a test drive on my Coos deer hunt. And these are 10 powers. These aren't the 15 by 56s. These are the new version that they rolled out this year. Last year they rolled out the 15 by 56s. And this year they came out with the 10 powers. And I got to look at them a little bit last week up in Reno. There's a lot of other great stuff coming from Leupold. So go to leupold.com and you will get to know about all of it. The other is onX Maps. I ran into Matt and Zach and Evan and all the great folks from onX here this morning. They're down here at SHOT Show also. They just, if you are someone who hunts like we do, or if you have had questions about is that public, is that private, if you're out hunting and you want to have the comfort that you are on land that you can hunt, it's amazing, the whole onX system, whether it's the new smart app that I think I'd say I'm 98% of the way converted to the smartphone app. There's still the 2% of time where I'm using the micro SD cards in a chip format in my GPS, but go to onxmaps.com and you will be able to get 20% off any other app products if you use promo code RANDY, R-A-N-D-Y. And then we have gohunt.com. Lorenzo and Brady were on the last podcast, and I hope that people saw that for what it was. It was trying to give a lot of information, just sharing deadlines and little tips and little tidbits that are helpful. If you haven't, maybe go listen to that podcast. I think it's got a lot of worthwhile stuff. So gohunt.com. If you want to sign up for their insider, which I suggest everybody does, if they do research, if they want the best draw odds, if they want strategy articles about how to draw tags, not just in that state, but a strategy of all of your states, all your species, all your interests that you have combined. The good folks there at Go Hunt have it dialed in. Amazing resource. There's a reason why I subscribe to all resources out there, and this is my go-to resource for everything. GoHunt.com. Sign up for Insider. Use promo code RANDY, R-A-N-D-Y, and you'll get $50 of free credit in their very, very serious backcountry gear store. I don't know if you even call it a store, a shop, or whatever, but they got a lot of great backcountry hunting gear there. And then we're heading off to Arizona tomorrow morning to hunt archery coos deer. Me, David Brinker from Sitka Gear, Brian Call from the Gritty Bowman, Sam Solholt, the dude with the public land school bus who you heard on our podcast earlier this year, Hank Shaw, Holly, his girlfriend, who happens to be the communications director for the California Waterfowl Association. We're going to have all kinds of people there. And the reason I say that is when we are there, we are going to be living out of Orion coolers. I drove down because I'm driving from here to Arizona, and I have a whole truck full of Orion coolers. And if you want to get the best coolers I know of, go to orioncoolers.com, use promo code Randy, and when you make your purchase, they are going to give you a really cool tumbler. And I don't care what you use it for. If you want to use it for beer or coffee or water or whatever, go to orioncoolers.com and use our promo code and let them know that they support us. They support public land advocacy. They support hunting. And you'll end up with a great cooler and a great tumbler. So with that, I'm going to hit one more switch here. And when I do that, Shane's mic is going to come live. And you are going to hear I don't know what Shane has to say, but he always has something worthwhile to listen to. So here we go, folks. Follow along. Well, folks, I told you that we had the most in-demand conservationist of our time, a speaker who I get mesmerized when I listen to him on a podcast or when I had the pleasure to hear him speak at the Wild Sheep Foundation last week. Shane Mahoney has come all the way from Canada just to be on our podcast. Well, not really. But Shane is so gracious with his time of being, you have appeared on our podcast more than any individual, Shane.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
You are, when you are on the podcast, the numbers go way up. Wow. So I guess maybe this is a marketing ploy and I owe you something, but mostly I so much appreciate our conversations and our discussions about conservation and history, and you get to see such a wider scope of the world with all your involvement with so many groups and so many places. Our audience, you are also the most in-demand request of any guest we have on the podcast.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much.
But for those of you who have not done so, you might want to go back and listen to some of our other podcasts where Shane was on, and he spoke about a very important, really, to me, really critical endeavor that he's embarked on, and it's been a multi-year project. And I'm just going to let Shane jump into it. Shane, in past podcasts, we've talked about your Wild Harvest Initiative.
Yes. And
I always like the updates. So since I get the updates from you while we're eating dinner or whatever, I would like you to give the audience the quick intro of what it is and where we're at with it at this point and where it's going.
All right. Well, thanks for the chance to inform people about this, because I do think it's an important and very worthwhile endeavor in support of hunting and in support, obviously, of wildlife. The Wild Harvest Initiative is a program to bring together all of the data that we have, all of the information that we have on the harvest of fish and wildlife in the United States and Canada, the harvest that is conducted legally by recreational hunters and anglers. It is an attempt not only to bring together the numbers of animals that are harvested through these mechanisms, but also to estimate the food value, the pounds, the actual pounds of food that these traditions are providing to families in both countries. Mm-hmm. We have long been experimenting with, analyses of the economic value of hunting, the number of jobs it creates, how it contributes to rural economies, the taxes that are paid by hunters and anglers, the special taxes and the individual taxes that are paid in support of conservation. But it is rather surprising, amazing really, that after almost 100 years of a highly successful conservation model that has seen the recovery and maintenance and rescue, in fact, of wildlife in both countries, that we didn't along the way really sort of compile the statistics on just how much food we were procuring, which was, not the only motivation, obviously, for hunters and anglers, but clearly one of the significant motivations. So I conceived of this idea and embarked on the process of gathering from all the state and provincial agencies all of this information, building a database. And it's not just building a database on the numbers and kinds of animals that we harvest, but coming up, as I said, with actual estimates of the amount of food that has actually been provided. In addition to that, however, what the Wild Harvest Initiative will do is we will estimate through analyses using economic models and economists themselves, we will actually come up with a number with respect to how much this food, if it was available on a marketplace, just how much this food is worth. I mean, the most simple calculations would be any sort of red meat that we harvest. It might be equivalent to beef, or white meat equivalent to pork or chicken or something of this nature. But I'm interested in something more refined in that. I'm interested in having the world recognize that this is not just any meat, that this is absolutely special meat, that this food is clean, it is highly nutritious, it is low in fat, it is high in protein, it is higher in protein level and in minerals and vitamins, in fact, than almost any domestic animals that we are able to raise, no matter what the process, and that at the same time, this food is actually being procured through an extraordinarily healthy activity, recreating in the outdoors, etc. And so I am really interested in society understanding that this food that is gathered by hunters and anglers does have not just a value to those individuals, but that our society should be putting a value on that food, just as we do on peaches that are grown somewhere.
In an orchard or
yes,
whatever.
Exactly. And so we will do this with the Wild Harvest Initiative. Another thing that I'm deeply, deeply interested in, which is also, just like the food value itself, kind of an obvious thing to everybody, but when you start to think about it, it's much more profound. I'm very interested in calculating what I'm calling a sharing index for this food. Every hunter listening to this today, and hopefully non-hunters who are listening to this today, but who may be no hunters, realize that one of the drives, and I use that term deliberately, one of the drives that seems to be embedded in hunters and those who partake of wild harvest generally is this need to share.
Right.
And at one level, we can describe this as just a nice thing to do, and we might wonder, why people do it. But when you analyze it, when you look at it, this is actually a very, very deep thing. People, as soon as they start to eviscerate an animal that they've taken, I know in my case this is true, and I know for many hunters that I know this is true, they immediately start to think about, in their mind, even as they're, opening up the animal and removing the entrails and, cutting behind the ribs to cut the animal in half, or, removing the hocks, or whatever part of the process we are involved in. Your little thoughts are floating through your mind of who you're going to share this with. I've got to give, I got to give Dad some of that. I got to give Granddad some of that. I give Uncle Jack some of that. Or, this colleague at work goes crazy for my venison or my elk or whatever. So we have this kind of drive within us to share this food. And so I'm interested in knowing exactly how big is that ripple effect. We are a small minority in society, those of us who hunt, obviously, and even those of us who hunt and fish.
Yes.
But we reach a great many people through this sharing drive. Probably 4, 5, 6, or 7 times as many people partake in the harvest we gather as we ourselves.
Right.
And so I'm very interested in getting a figure, getting a handle on this, because I want to make hunting relevant to a wider society. And let's say there's 40 million people who hunt and fish in Canada and the United States each year. Well, there could very well be 200, 300 million people who actually share in that harvest.
Benefit from it.
Now, for people in the political and policy world and in the legislative world, these kinds of numbers begin to make a lot of sense.
That gets attention.
And plus the fact, those people who are sharing in that harvest are obviously supporting hunting in some way, or they're certainly not opposed to hunting.
Right.
And they also get a window into just one of the great benefits of hunting, which is this incredible food that we harvest. But I'm also interested in the other side of that. So you kill your elk, and you take some of that meat to a friend, a neighbor, or a family member. Just think about their reaction. You give it to them, and first of all, they treat it as though you've given them something really rare and beautiful.
Yes.
They don't just say, oh, thank you very much, and toss it on the chair in the entranceway. Thank you very much. But think about how many times they go down exactly the same sharing road. Because how many times do you give that to somebody, your wild meat, your roast of moose or something, and they will immediately say, oh, thank you so much for that, Randy. And you know what? I'm going to cook that now when my son-in-law comes over.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to cook that now on Sunday dinner because everybody... They immediately start to think about this sharing. I believe there is something really profound going on in this sharing of the wild because, as I've mentioned many times before, we don't go to the grocery store and buy a roast of meat to give to our neighbor, our friend, or our family. And if we did, they would think we were crazy, but they wouldn't appreciate it. I mean, right?
They would have
appreciate it
nowhere near the appreciation.
The same way. And the other thing about this, I want the Wild Harvest Initiative to normalize hunting. I want people to understand that this is just one of many ways in which we gather from nature. So we gather firewood, we gather mushrooms, we gather wild berries, we gather wild fruits, we gather wild honey, we gather wild flowers. And every single one of those processes of gathering from the wild, just like hunting, has embedded within it this desire to share. So if somebody gathers wild berries and they make jams or they make jellies, what's the first thing they do?
They bring you some.
They bring you some. They give you some. And you say, fantastic. You may have 20 jars of jam in your refrigerator that you bought at a grocery store or something, but all of a sudden that wild berry mixture becomes something really special. And it's the same way with sharing it. People break out that wild jam and jelly, and they say, this, my brother gave me this, or a friend of mine gave me this. It's wild blueberries, it's wild raspberries, it's wild huckleberries, it's this kind of thing. This is a phenomenon that we have overlooked as a message to modern society about the benefits of wild gathering, of which hunting is one component.
Right.
And everyone who is normal in this world, Randy, everyone who's normal in this world, from any nation in this world, of any culture in this world, admires and respects people who give and people who share.
Universally.
It is universal, and I believe it fundamentally derives from our hunting past, when as hunter-gatherers, of course, that's what we had to do. We all shared. And that's the only way we were able to survive. And somehow, through the long chain of human history, through all of the urbanization and the technological changes that have taken place, when we no longer need to do these things, we go and do them, and when we do them, they become special on our end, the harvester, and they become special on the end of the people with whom we share it with. This is a profound phenomenon. So I want to measure this. Mm-hmm. And I want to unleash this information, like all the rest of the information from the Wild Harvest Initiative, on the publics of Canada and the United States and the world. The other thing that I want to do with this Wild Harvest Initiative, I want to ask people to think about the consequences, the real consequences of doing away with these activities.
Right.
So let's say that we determine tomorrow that there will never be any more hunting and never more angling in the United States and in Canada. We as a society are going to have to find some way to replace the billions with a B, the billions of pounds, not just of any food, but the billions of pounds of lean, high-quality protein that has not been affected by growth hormones, antibiotics, or any other kind of system. We're going to have to replace that, if we could use the term organic. That's a bit of an elastic term, but let's use it for simplicity. We're going to have to replace those billions of pounds of organic food that we currently acquire with some other kind of food that's going to have to be grown the same way. And we need to think about then, what's the cost? How much wildlife habitat is going to have to be taken for that?
Yeah.
How much fertilizer is going to have to be used for that? How much insecticide is going to have to be used for that? How much fuel is going to have to be consumed to do that? And when you weigh out the cost to wildlife, not just of hunted wildlife, but of all the insects, all of the
the snakes, the songbird,
everything that is affected by this, and you realize that the alternative you had before, these hunting and angling traditions, really are, as we will represent it in the Wild Harvest Initiative, as one of the most environmentally friendly food procurement systems in the bloody world. Why would we ever want to get rid of this when the whole world is driving itself crazy trying to come up with these kinds of solutions?
Right, and we've done it in a sustainable. We have found a model that sustains, that self-funds, that vests people in the land and waters that produce it.
Absolutely true.
What we call conservation.
That's the other thing this is the other phenomenon. What's driving all of this, just as you point out, is this kind of incentivized community. And not just us ourselves who hunt, but the community who supports us too, and who still believe, in the majority in America and Canada, that this legal activity is an appropriate thing to do. Something that society should accept, tolerate, and help support. And when they see the efforts we make, not just in sharing with our friends and neighbors, but sharing with the disadvantaged, the helping people who are hungry and whose lives have not turned out that well. And there's programs in almost every state and province where hunters, again, this sharing phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
The same thing. We're sharing with all of these people, trying to give something back, yet only a small percentage of us have developed the skills to be actually able to step off the pavements of society, venture onto the lands and waters, and come back with animals that were living, that have incredible capacities to evade us and to avoid us, and so on and so forth. We make the effort to harvest those animals, but we share it with so many people. So I will combine eventually all of this information with all of the other economic data and socially relevant data that there is. I'm going to share it with the medical community. We're going to share it with the fitness community. We're going to share it with all the people who harvest in nature. We're going to share with all the people who are out there in nature. And will there be a benefit to the recruitment of hunting, for example, out of this? I believe this is going to be our strongest recruitment tool that we can possibly have. For some reason, the world has gone crazy about food, Randy. Right?
It has.
The chefs are the rock stars, man.
They are.
And a white apron, and you're the guy or the girl. Cookbooks sell like crazy. Everybody wants to eat something different and something new. So we are perfectly positioned, the hunting and angling community. We are perfectly positioned to be able to join in this enthusiasm for healthy food and healthy living, because this is what our recreational traditions have been about for 100 years and more.
Yeah. Well, when I first heard about it, I was so excited because as someone who's been engaged in these discussions for 20, 25 years, there's always been the struggle of how do you articulate to somebody who doesn't have our context and has not grown up eating wild game, procuring it, whether it's fish, game, whatever. How do you have that conversation in today's world where you're only maybe availed 30 seconds to have a conversation?
Yeah.
And in a world where maybe our messaging of the media wants something that's a little more controversial or whatever, as soon as I heard you were doing this, I'm like, all right, how can I help? How can I use my platforms, my connections, the groups I belong to that I participate in? Because we've searched for, if you want to call it, the silver bullet for hunting. I think in doing that, we've kind of viewed hunting as its own little thing, its own little world, without understanding that hunting is something much bigger. Mm-hmm. Your description of it in this Wild Harvest Initiative, the sharing aspect, the food aspect, makes hunting something much larger, much easier to explain.
It does, and it also, Randy, makes wild creatures even more valuable.
More valuable.
I mean, people in society love to see them. And that's being demonstrated in so many different ways now. I mean, the animal imagery is everywhere. And as I've said in many lectures and maybe even on your earlier podcast, hopefully I'm not boring people, but, but you know, we have little geckos selling us our insurance, and we have ducks selling us our fertilizer. I mean, this is a phenomenon that's going on. And so people obviously have this interest in animals. And most people, contrary to the cliches, you know, that people don't know where meat comes from, or, you know, the people growing up today don't know, you know, that an egg comes from a chicken. You know, the truth of the matter is most people understand
they know that
animals die to provide the food and fish, you know, the fish and the meat and so on that are on our plates. They do know that. They might not want to think about it all the time, but they know it. And so we are able, I think, to easily explain that this hunting tradition, yes, it does involve animal death for the procurement of food. Mm-hmm. Now, it is true that every hunter takes more from the hunt than just the food.
Right.
There is no question about that. There's no question. It was always the case. Even the hunter-gatherer societies that had to hunt to just survive, we know from their mythology and from their stories and from the historical studies of their cultures that they too took more than just the food from their hunting experience. That's why they mythologized the animals they did. That's why they loved them. That's why they were mesmerized by them. So we know that the hunter is taking more from that experience, and there are many aspects of it. But we also know that for the majority of hunters, the vast, vast majority of hunters, that this food that they acquire is one of the great prizes that comes back from that. You know, there's a reason we carry the bloody things out, Randy.
Right.
Right? As they eat
for
them.
Sure. There's a reason why Randy has enjoyed the benefits of moose burgers, of a moose's sun shot in October, that I almost need to watch what the speed limit signs are on my way home from work, knowing that I have thawed burger ready to be on the grill. That feeling in eating it, preparing it, my wife has observed many times. You get way more excited about grilling something or cooking something that we've caught or we've hunted than chicken or whatever. And I can't explain it. I wish I could, but
well, I think it relates to this. I mean, I think it relates to this relationship of obviously, number one, procuring your own food is like people who garden when they grow their own vegetables. Right. I mean, they feel more about the potato they grow in the bit of dirt in the backyard than they do about the potato in the grocery store. It's kind of, at one level, it's kind of weird, but on the other way, they've tended it. They've watched the plant grow. They've weeded the garden. They've worried about moisture. They've worried about grubs and things that destroy their crops. I mean, they have a sense of investment and ownership in that. And of course, that's what the hunter seeks to do. He seeks to possess. I mean, this is what the Greeks and the Romans, when they were writing about hunting, talked about. It was the possession of the animal that was really sought. Yeah. And then, of course, there were many, many things that you did with the animal. In some cases, you kept a remembrance of that hunt, which might be the horns or the antlers or the pelt or something. Mm-hmm. But you also, of course, consume that animal. And so I think this this deep emotionality about it can be very complex, but some of what we experience as hunting is quite difficult to explain to the non-hunting public. Yeah. But the beauty about food, Randy, is that it is not difficult to explain to them that you want healthy, nutritious food that you take responsible for gathering yourself.
Yeah, that is the easiest, by far the easiest. We were doing a wilderness backpack elk hunt in Arizona, just outside of Flagstaff. and it was a beautiful weekend in northern Arizona. The colors of the aspens were tremendous at this time, and there's a lot of people who come up from Phoenix and Tucson, large metro areas, to enjoy the colors. Well, it just so happened that we shot this elk, and it was quite warm, and so we hung it overnight, and we knew we had to get that elk out the next day, which was a Sunday. And the amount of people on the trailhead was significant. It was about a 5-mile hike down, and in the last mile and a half, I would say, there were just lots and lots and lots of people. And here we are walking out with elk quarters pointing out the tops of our packs, the sides of our packs bursting with game bags, and you cannot hide or in any way disguise a bloody game bag full of your elk meat.
No, it's hard, Randy. I accept that. Yeah, it's kind of hard.
And on my back, I have a front quarter, and I have the antlers, and I have a rifle. And I'm thinking, as I see the first group coming up the trail, I'm thinking, I wonder how this interaction's going to happen. Fortunately, the first two guys in our group were trailing llamas with our camp gear. And back to your point of how animals have an effect on people.
I know what happened. Yeah.
Everybody wanted to stop and talk about the llamas.
Yeah.
And then they would say, well, they'd look to the back where I'm there with a rifle and antlers, and they see meat in everyone else's pack, and they're like, were you hunting? Or something similar to that. And I said, well, yeah, we were hunting, but mostly we're grocery shopping. I said, he's got 60 pounds in his pack. I got 40 in mine plus the antlers. And every person we encountered when we talked about the fact that we are going to eat all this, we even invited some of them down to the trailhead and said, we'll cook something for you. Multitudes of people on our way out of there, every one of them had a positive experience because we talked about that. How cool is it that we can come to these public lands and, for lack of a better term, shop. Do our grocery shopping.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you could see some of them were not people who at first were very open to the idea. The one person said, do you have a gun? I'm like, yeah, it's empty. I said, but that's how we get our food. And within 4 or 5 minutes, she was wanting to know how we cook the food. How long will the food? Will this meat spoil? No, we have it. We'll get it on ice, and so it was a remarkable observation for not just me, for everybody else in our group, of how focusing and being honest about what we were doing, and not trying to hide it or deny it, but explain the values of the food aspect. Was so non-threatening, and to these people just brought their guard down to where now they wanted to have a discussion about, the multiple people said, well, how much wild meat do you eat in a year? I said, sure. And most of us would respond, well, we don't know how much, but most meals, the majority of our meals. And so I almost wish we could have filmed that interaction.
It would have been a really good idea. But, we have been conducting surveys, public opinion surveys. We love public opinion surveys, don't we? I mean, everybody's doing public opinion surveys all the time, and it seems like we can't get enough of them. And now we're doing a whole bunch more of public opinion surveys about what the public feels about this, what the public feels about that, many of them around the issue of hunting. And, certain basic elements of these public opinion surveys are just not going to change. We've been conducting public opinion surveys in the United States of America since the 1960s on the attitudes of the general public towards hunting. And for 60 bloody years, those surveys have been consistent in that if you talk about hunting in the context of food procurement, the vast, vast majority of people in American society and Canadian society support it. To some extent, or in some sense, I wonder why we're still doing so many bloody surveys. Because they haven't changed in 60 years, and so we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that other terms, other relationships in the hunting world, when we talk about even sport or trophy or things of that nature, we introduce those terms, the support falls.
Yeah.
But when we say it in the context of food, just like your experience, I was in a high-end restaurant in Las Vegas last year. A friend of mine brought to me some smoked bear meat. He had killed a black bear in Pennsylvania, his home state. Mm-hmm. I've hunted black bear a number of times, and I've taken bear three or four occasions, and I absolutely love bear meat. You have to be very careful how you treat the animal and remove all the fat, but when you do it properly, bear meat is absolutely exceptional. And I have even traded moose meat for bear meat on occasion.
Wow.
So anyway, he knew I love bear meat, and he had this bear meat smoked, and it was superb. It was a really wonderful job that was done on it. So we're sitting in this restaurant, high-end restaurant. There's 5 or 6 of us at the table, and we're getting ready to order our food. And this young man comes out, this embryo, 22, 23 years of age, trying to, be professional and ask us what we want to eat and so on. And so he's giving us our ice water, and my friend has taken out a package of this meat, and we have it on the table, and we're just chewing a little bit of it as we're eating a little bit of it as we're waiting to make our orders. So he's naturally interested, because not that many people bring food to a restaurant, right? When they're ready to order. So anyway, he asks what it is, and we say, this is actually bear meat. Would you like some? And he instantly said yes.
Oh, wow.
So we gave him some of this bear meat, and he goes back inside, how waiters disappear into some secret place in the restaurant, magically emerge with your food. And so he comes back out, and he said, that was so good. He said, the people in the kitchen are wondering if they could have some. This is in a high-end restaurant, believe me, a very high-end restaurant. So we give him more. And so as the evening goes on, we learn that in the kitchen, the chef himself is eating this and loving it.
Wow.
So it just goes to show that food has a magical effect on us for very good reason. We are concerned about clean water and food because they're absolutely life-sustaining. Yes. And I think we need to realize that not only is the angle of hunted food or wild meat interesting to people who hunt it, but the world is becoming very much interested in diversity of experience. Mm-hmm. And this is nowhere more true than in the culinary world. People want to experience new foods. Yes. I had a medical doctor make a great statement not too long ago when I was giving a lecture on the Wild Harvest Initiative, and she stood up and she said, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. And she said, there are a lot of people in the San Francisco Bay Area who are opposed to hunting. But she said, I can tell you something else. There are far more people in the San Francisco Bay Area that are intrigued with new eating experiences. Yeah. There you go. This project, this program that you're developing of Wild Harvest, she said, is definitely something that community that might have, a challenge in accepting hunting for other reasons or even for any reason, they are still drawn to overcome that opposition when it comes to the opportunity to have something truly unique as a culinary experience. Yeah. We are on to something here, and we have built the database now. We are populating the database with all of the information, and we already have some insight as to the magnitude of this harvest, Randy. And I'll tell you only this at this point, because we want to make sure we bring these results out properly to the academic community, the broad public, the journalistic groups, and so on. The harvest is so significant that we need to be prudent in how we bring the scale of this harvest out to the public.
Really?
Yes. And then the flip side or other aspect of that scale of harvest is that this is completely sustainable. We have identified it as being sustainable for 100 years. And the truth of the matter is, if we were to dedicate ourselves to the management of lands for the production of wildlife in Canada and the United States, try to more actively manage those landscapes for wildlife, we could vastly, vastly increase this harvest.
That's power.
Well, that's another reason we're going to use, this is another way of using the Wild Harvest Initiative to introduce people to hunting, to place a greater value on wildlife, to place a greater value on wildlife habitat, to treat those wildlife habitats as food reservoirs, to treat wildlife as one of our food security options, and also to turn our attention in society to the fact that the lands and waters we have, as productive as they are, with what we have learned through scientific study and natural observation over the last 50 to 100 years, we can vastly increase the productivity of those lands if our focus is wildlife.
Yeah.
If our focus is not wildlife, well, then we manage the lands for other things.
Other reasons, yeah.
But if we focus on wild animals, we could really have more wild animals for people to see, more wild animals for people to harvest, more wild animals just simply to know we have an existence on those lands. So it's going very well, Randy, and the partnership is expanding. And I would encourage anybody listening to this podcast, if they want to know more, to just go to conservationvisions.com to get information on it.
So let's slow down. I was going to ask that. Conservationvisions.com, not org.com.
.com.
Yeah, okay.
And also anybody who may be listening in the audience who has an interest in supporting it in some way, we are trying to build for this program the most diverse, widest coalition. Yes, we want hunting organizations. Yes, we want outdoor-related industries, and we do have those. We want state and provincial agencies, and we do have those. We want private citizens. But we want people concerned with human health, organizations concerned with human health, with preventative medicine, with nutrition, with food, with good quality food, with food security, with all of those things. We want to demonstrate through this program that we can have a broad coalition in society interested in this, each for their own particular reasons.
Right.
But at the bottom, at the end point of this, it all relies on having wildlife. And that all relies on having land that will support wildlife. And the harvest depends on us having access to those lands and those waters to harvest that wildlife.
Yeah. You have just taken an extremely complicated expression I've always looked for, and you've given it in about 30 seconds, Shane, of how important that is and why it's important when you talk about the quality, the sustainability, the land.
Yep.
It goes to the land and then access to that land.
Well, you know, Randy, if you talk enough, you get better at
it. Well, my wife would say that I should be a professional at that point.
You are.
Well, I don't know. I'm an amateur trying to disguise himself as a professional. But thanks for that update. I'm intrigued. You gave a presentation the other day. I believe the topic of your discussion was it permission to speak? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
And it kind of gets to this whole food idea. And you'd mentioned how hunters have earned their permission to speak. And maybe I was trying to hear more than I wanted to hear, but it seemed as though you were challenging us to say, what are you doing to maintain this privilege you've earned? And maybe I'm putting words in your mouth or saying it differently, but I sometimes wonder, and I'm in the business of communicating messages, all those great things you talk about from the food aspects and from how it's dependent upon productive land and clean air and clean water, is some of what we do in the hunting world so narrowly focused that we run the risk of losing our voice by our behaviors. Not we say one thing as our motivation, but we message something else. And does eventually that erode our permission to speak as who we are and as leaders in this?
Well, I mean, I think all of us that are engaged in these activities today recognize that there is a growing concern amongst the publics of the world over the issue of hunting. We know it's becoming increasingly controversial.
If you deny that, you're a denier.
You're living under a mushroom.
Yeah.
I mean, if you deny that, and there is part of that is that derives from just the general patterns of change in society that none of us can take credit or blame for. I mean, society changes over time. Society in the United States is different than it was 50 years ago. It was different 50 years ago than it was 50 years before that. And there have been 1,000 influences that every day impinge with a little bit of pressure to change society and move it in a certain direction. But we also have to, as a hunting community, accept the fact that, we are part of those pressures ourselves.
Yeah.
At the same time that we want to have our traditions protected and preserved, we are also part of the influence that is shaping the society of today. And we have to recognize that as the debates over hunting intensify, it becomes more and more important as to how we represent ourselves. This can be frustrating to us. Mm-hmm. Some hunters will say, to hell with that. It's my legal right, and right. I'm going to carry on. But the truth of the matter is that unless we maintain a relevance for hunting, unless we maintain a certain number of people who are engaged in that activity, it will become irrelevant. And once it becomes irrelevant, it will surely disappear.
Yes.
And so we have to be always trying to remind people of the aspects that we stand for, the things that we stand for, that we know will matter to everybody. Conservation is one of those things, obviously.
Yeah.
People admire people who work for the world, for the conservation of nature. And it doesn't matter if it's from the hunting side of things or the non-hunting side of things. There are, rightfully so, millions and millions and millions of people who support, the researchers that have, taught us so much about chimpanzees and mountain gorillas that certainly not only were never part of the hunting world, but undoubtedly are opposed to the hunting world. But they're involved in the world of conservation, and people do admire these women who did so much to bring to our attention the plight of those amazing creatures. So we know that society admires the conservationists. It doesn't matter where they come from. And we can leave aside the debates over preservation versus conservation for the moment. Let's just call them people who care about the natural world.
Right.
People admire that. So this is the aspect of the hunting world that people are going to admire most. I have said this for 30 years, and I say it, I'll continue to say it till I am no longer present on the earth. We can talk about anything else, but this is the fundamentally most important things that hunters have to express. The kind of flip side of that is that people are concerned with animal death. People are concerned with death anyway, right? For good reason. Yeah. Life is precious. Yep. Life is precious. All life is precious. And people are concerned about it. They look at a little bird that has fallen out of a nest, and they know that they try to put it back there because they don't want that little life to disappear. Yeah. Well, don't we do this? All of us do this.
All of us.
So this is a natural thing. Therefore, it is very natural for some people to develop a great discomfort with the idea of animal death, particularly if they don't have to see it themselves any longer. So the very last thing we want to be perceived as are people who glorify in the death of animals. Yeah. To partake in the process for a reason such as food, just as you've explained as your experience in Arizona, that is completely different from glorifying in the death of an animal. And we all know, everyone listening to this podcast knows, that you can find on social media some of the most horrific examples of the glorification of death that it is possible to imagine.
Right.
Even beyond imagination.
Right. In abundance, unfortunately.
Yes. And so we have to realize that over a long period of time, while this may only be a percentage of the hunting community, obviously responsible for this, that too has been an influence on society's understanding of what hunting is. Because they have never met the other side. They have largely only seen this. Most outdoor television was never interested in showing the real conservation side. That's changing, fortunately, somewhat now, Randy. But this is a fact.
Right.
I mean, I remember a time in this business when, if you didn't have 3 kill shots in a show, it was considered not so good.
Right, yeah.
And then it went down to 2, and on and on. So we have to take, and the industries around us also have to take.
Those industries are where the funding comes from.
They have to take a level of responsibility for the circumstances in which we find ourselves today. My argument is normalize hunting. Not glorify it, not place it in some other realm. Normalize it. Normalize hunting so that you can stand and have a conversation across a fence with somebody who has their own garden, is raising their vegetables. So you can have a conversation at the gas station with somebody who actually is interested in keeping bees or in harvesting wild honey or something like that. Normalize the damn thing.
Yeah.
Not treat it as some kind of gladiator kind of exercise that we're engaged in. Because that's not what it's supposed to be. It's not what it is, in fact. And so, yes, I do believe, I was talking in that particular lecture about Fair Chase and Boone and Crockett's programs surrounding that and all of that. And I have a long historical reflection on where those terms come from because I know the history of them. Mm-hmm. But, I was just trying to make this point that, we are a minority that is trying to explain a very complicated thing. None of us can truly express the hurricane of emotions and feelings and reactions and stimulation and wonderment and sadness and all of that comes together in hunting. So if we can't do it ourselves, how do we expect the naive public to come to an understanding? And if they're going to come to an understanding, we better make sure that we are at least giving them the raw material to come to the right understanding about this activity. Yeah. And I have argued for a long, long time that we have done a great deal of damage ourselves to our tradition, and we need to be careful in considering our relevance because we are not guaranteed of the support of that public, Randy.
Right.
There's no guarantee. No. And it is becoming increasingly difficult for people to relate to this, except for those of us who do it. Society is moving in a different direction. There's a rising empathy for wildlife worldwide, not just here, and not just because HSUS has a viewpoint, or IFAW has a viewpoint, or PETA has a viewpoint. There's a rising change around the world in terms of people's attitudes towards animals, because we're removing ourselves more and more from the need to kill them ourselves. Mm-hmm. It's natural. I mean, I have a very good friend of mine and a mentor of mine, and I can't mention his name. Perhaps it mightn't be fair, but probably he will be fine with. But I won't for this purpose. He is a big hunter, and has been a hunter for 60 years. He has been a hunter and an accomplished hunter. And he's also an individual who has raised a lot of his own food, raises chickens, raises geese, has raised turkeys, and so raised rabbits, all for food. And when I would come to visit him, even though he would be out hunting the same day, if it came to the time when he needed to kill some of his rabbits or some of his hens or some of his geese, etc., he would ask me to help him do it, and in most cases to do it for him. Because he had come to know those individual animals. Yep. He wasn't a silly person. He wasn't somebody who didn't know what animal death meant. It's just that in that particular circumstance, with animals he had known and he had raised and he had fed himself, he just felt more comfortable if somebody else killed them. And so I would do this for him. And what that story emphasizes is that the hunter, too, has built in to him and her this empathy for animals. Yeah. And no hunter need deny this to pretend they're a big shot or they're a rough, tough guy or whatever. That's all excuse the expression, but it's horseshit.
Right.
You know,
It is.
because that's all it is. We are all affected by this. You know, do hunters not cry when they lose a dog that's been with them for 15 years? Yes, they do.
Right.
So there isn't this we and them, we the knowledgeable, we the pure, they the crazy, they the imbecile, they the animal lover, they the tree hugger, they the greenie, and all those stupid little juvenile terms. We all have this empathy for animals. It depends on context.
Yeah.
Their context is different. They've never killed an animal. Their context is different. All they want are live animals, and the animals that are live in their lives, they want to live forever, just like we want our dogs to live forever, and our cats to live forever, and our horses to live forever. And so, if we don't understand this complexity, we who pride ourselves on knowing all about the natural world, you know, the dynamics of ecosystems and playing our natural role, if we can't come to these kinds of understandings and philosophical levels, then let's not expect the average person who has no engagement with this to come to this kind of deep and profound understanding of all of these complexities. It's completely and utterly silly for us to do that. And to call them names, that's just so juvenile. I mean, why don't we spit at them? Or, you know, like throw beans at them or something. I mean, it would be just as juvenile to do this as to call them these silly names.
Yeah.
As it is for them to call us the names, of course,
Right.
that's just as juvenile too.
Yeah, and when you say that about context, it is so important. And we are sitting here. We are on the 43rd floor of the Palazzo Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. There's probably an overwhelming majority of people in this city who have, as you expressed, have not killed their own food. I would bet it's a majority of people. And to think that their life experiences of living in an urban area where daily life is, everything is man-made, man-altered, whatever you want to call it, to think that they're going to have a context in their life experiences that they can understand us through some simple image or some label we want to hang on this group or that group is a terminal path to any effort to try get them to understand us. You cannot do that without having appreciation for what their life context is.
No, you can't. And I'll tell you something else. And this relates to the story of my friend. You take a group of people and bring them into a modern abattoir. And you can have a lot of hunters in that group as well as non-hunters in that group. And every one of those people, with very few exception, I would say with no exception, is going to have a sense of concern, a sense of tension, a sense of, in some cases, abhorrence, a sense of, even though modern abattoirs try to do things as humanely as possible, to compare what takes place in those abattoirs with what takes place on the hunt for an elk in Arizona or the hunt for a moose, you know, in the barrens of Newfoundland or something, are two completely, absolutely different worlds. And the hunter would react to the difference between those worlds absolutely. And so would the non-hunter react to the difference of those worlds if they could see both at the same time.
Yeah.
So this idea that even because we harvest animals, because we kill animals, that we are therefore always comfortable with animal death, that is also untrue, Randy.
That is
right?
Completely untrue.
So we have to admit all that we share with one another with regard to our reactions and our feelings towards animals. And that, of course, is one of the common roadways to understanding between us. Mm-hmm. But if we want to position ourselves as the kind of people who are, you know, we do it, we're indifferent, we know it has to be done, we know how to do it kind of thing, and what people on the other side can sometimes hear is, therefore we really don't care about the death of that animal.
Yeah.
And I just know that that's absolutely untrue for a great many hunters. And I think the public needs to understand that we not only care about their death, we care very much about their life. Because, when people ask me, because I give lectures that have nothing to do with hunting, they just talk about my love of animals and how I feel about them and what they've given me in my life and what I believe is the truth, that they made us human. When I give that kind of lecture, people will often ask me, well, how can you hunt? How is it possible for someone like you, in quotation marks, to hunt?
Yeah.
And I explain to them that, one of the reasons is because I know the animal that I hunt. I shoot a moose that is, 13 years of age or 17 years of age or whatever the animal is. I shoot that animal, and for all those years, as I was living my life, he or she was living her or his life in a completely natural state, in a completely natural world, not fenced, not caged, not fed. Yes, they were escaping predators. Yes, they had to find food. Yes, they had to deal with intense weather systems, deep snows and freezes and thaws, and they had to deal with their natural environment. It is true, and it can be very harsh despite their adaptations. But the point is that they lived free, and if I may say so, to give it a human context, they lived well.
Yeah.
And then we do kill them, but hopefully, in the best of hunts, they don't even know we have killed them.
Yeah.
And even in most hunts, it is a very short period of time in which they feel pain and in which they suffer to any extent. And the true hunter tries to absolutely minimize that. And there is nothing more disconcerting to even the experienced hunter than to wound.
Right.
To badly wound.
Anyone who's done it.
It requires more self-discipline than anything else in hunting when the animal is wounded to then take the second careful shot and place it well. Every one of us know this is true. So our empathy for animals is it's no different than the empathy of the person who has never done this. It's just a matter of context and scale and experience, that's all.
Yeah.
And to claim for either sector in society to claim ownership over any of this, as only they can understand it or appreciate it, to me, that's just a falsehood. It's a myth. It's created to serve some purpose, but the purpose is certainly not to serve the conservation of wildlife.
Yeah. And I often get critics who say, I cannot believe that you would go and speak or be on a panel or participate or have a discussion with whatever label they want to hang on some group that they view as, quote unquote, the enemy. And that's even reached to the point of now, I'll call it the partisan divide, where I feel that in our effort to try defend what we do or try to create some evil enemy out there on one side or the other, you brought it up as, when we call them greenies or tree huggers or whatever, there's times I consider myself pretty much a greenie.
Of course. Well, hopefully we all are to some extent a greenie.
My brother is a logger, but he shares the same kind of attachment to the land that I do. So those labels and those tags are, to me, when someone does that, it's I internally say, this person has no defense for their argument. Mm-hmm. And so now I see in what I would say is a world that's changed in the last 10 years of my involvement in this is a concern I share, and I'm hoping you can articulate it maybe better than I have in podcasts when I've brought it up in the past, because I just bluntly say that I'm of the party of hunting, fishing, conservation, and public access. Mm-hmm. And that's my way of saying I have no use for politicizing the important issues of conservation, of clean air, clean water, productive land. And I don't know how it is in Canada where you are at. You're a very astute observer of what we do in the States. You spend a lot of time in the States. You are asked to speak here on these topics with great regularity. I worry that hunting and conservation is letting themselves be drawn into a political wrestling match that I guess hunters are a cross-section of society, so our behaviors, our utilization of media and how we inform ourselves is probably the same as the rest of society. But I worry about a trend I see accelerating of politicizing and demonizing this group or that group, this side or that side, no matter the issue, no matter the topic that is relevant to hunting, to access, to conservation, to clean air, clean water, all of those things. And maybe I'm too worried about it. Maybe I'm trying to see something that isn't there. But in the last 10 years, I've seen that, and I've maybe my study of history isn't good, but I've not seen it to the degree of what I feel today. And how does that? Where's that trail leading? I worry about that. And
well, there's a lot in that.
Sorry, Shane.
That kind of there's a lot of questions that are buried in there. First of all, I guess there has always been, to some extent, a relationship between politics and conservation, because conservation is a public policy issue. So at that level, there always has been some kind of interface. I think that the birth of conservation showed that the leadership at the time, the kind of Grinnells and the Roosevelts and others, fought really two wars. One was for public opinion. This is why the writers like George Bird Grinnell and Forest and Stream at the time used that to influence public opinion. And of course, Roosevelt did that with as many books and as many articles and as many lectures as well. But he also realized that at some point, those ideas had to be brought into public policy. And that meant a legislative kind of process. Yeah. So in that sense, there has always been necessarily an interface of some kind, an exchange some kind between the idea of conservation and the community of conservationists and elected governments.
Right.
So at that level, we have to sort of say, yes, I understand. But there can be a difference in that relationship where the interface is not with the broad idea of politics and conservation, but the idea is that some component of the conservation world wishes to identify itself with only a certain component of the political world.
Right. It's a good way to put it.
And I agree with you, Randy, that I think this is probably being brought out in more relief. It's happening in a more demonstrative, manifest, concrete way today, so that it is more observable, even to the more casual observer, that this is happening. There is more of that kind of conservation politic being embedded in the conservation movement, rather than an interface between the conservation movement and politics. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is the difference. And I think the reason for that, in part, is because the hunting community has been under great pressure, and increasing pressure, for now probably 25 to 30 years, probably even longer than that, actually. Right. The seal hunt issue in Newfoundland is now a 30-odd year, 35-year-old issue, which, as I said at the time, look out, hunting world, because this is what's coming.
Yeah.
And I was completely ignored. And even today, people ignore the relationship between that phenomenon and what's happened in terms of the controversies over hunting now of all forms. But I think, the pressure that has built over that time has been accumulative, right? It collects and it collects and it collects, and it puts ever more restrictions on broader thinking, I think, in a community when they are constantly under pressure, because they react for quick solutions. They want quick solutions. they begin to feel caged and criticized constantly and so on and so forth. And they want a fast way out, like a caged animal wants to get through the door. It'll gnaw the bars of a cage down if it can to escape. And I think this is why, and I agree with you, and I think this is why it has happened, that we are seeing an escalation in the politicization of conservation today from within both the hunting community, the sustainable use community, and frankly, on the more preservationist side of the equation with the more preservationist community.
Right.
Now, as I said in my address at the opening of the Wonders of Wildlife in Springfield, Missouri, Johnny Morris's great museum and aquarium that he's unleashed upon the world, which
everyone needs to go see that.
Yeah, I mean, that's
impressive.
Just extraordinary. I commented a little bit about this, and I said that, we should never be bringing conservation to the level of politics. We should be bringing politics up to the level of conservation.
Boy, that's...
and I firmly believe this, because if you think about it, Randy, and you ask the question buried also in your sort of introduction and commentary before this, what happens if we really, stake our case on a political party as being the future of our tradition or of conservation or of wildlife or of any of the things we cherish? What it means inevitably in your country in particular with a two-party system, let's face it, that's all you have, which is a rarity in the world, but you have a two-party system. It would mean ultimately that what we would hope for is 4 to 8 years of movement in a certain direction, and most likely then another 4 to 8 years as governments inevitably change, of moving back in some other kind of direction. And as we align ourselves and put our money and our energies and our sort of efforts to engage in debate over conservation into that kind of seesaw effect, the risk is, of course, that we end up making very little or no progress. And only if we are fundamentally concerned, I think, about our own specific view of what we want and are not thinking about the broad issues of what wildlife requires, could we ever think it affordable to have that kind of an approach?
Right.
The other thing I will say is that everyone knows this who has heard me speak. I am an admirer of the United States of America.
Yeah, you speak very highly.
Yes, and I came to this country, to speak beginning probably 25 years ago, and I have had many opportunities to come here. I have many friends here, and I've had, just been treated wonderfully all those times. But my views of America strengthened very much as I had more experience in America. Not the opposite. Some people say, once you really learn about America, some Europeans and others will say that to me, you'll change your mind. I say, well, it's been just the opposite for me. So, and I but I stand in defense and my commentaries about the United States of America in many forms around the world that Americans don't hear. And I do that for very good reasons, I believe, not for frivolous reasons. Part of what has led me there has been a deep reading of American history, and part of that has been a careful observation of American life and American communities as I see them, as I drive through them, as I visit them, and as I talk to people. And part of all of that has taught me something that I don't believe can be challenged. And that is, if I look at the broad arena of conservation in the United States of America, going from, say, 1880 to the present time. And I look at the investments that have been made by Democratic or Republican administrations in the broad areas of conservation, protection of land, protection of monuments, Clean Water Acts, Endangered Species Act, Environmental Assessment Acts, across the whole spectrum of activity. I do not find a party bias.
Yeah.
We have had Republican administrations that have done just amazing things environmentally, for example. We've had Democratic administrations that have been quite supportive of hunting, for example. and fishing. At the Wonders of Wildlife opening, we had President Bush Jr., we had President Carter, we had President Bush Sr., who had a message delivered digitally to us, and so on and so forth. All three men have been supportive and continue to this day to engage in these activities.
Yeah.
So I also don't see the evidence in support of trying to politicize this business.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a grave mistake for us to ever believe that any political party, any president, can come to the White House, can come to, the world of American politics at a federal or even at a state level, and have as their absolute primary responsibility that they're going to worry about the hunting and angling community or the parks and natural areas community or whatever.
Right.
Let's face it, being president of the United States is kind of a heavy job. You know what I mean?
A lot going on there.
There's a lot going on there. And I mean, so I think what we ought to be bringing, as we did in the beginning of conservation, we ought to be bringing to the body politic, not trying to curry favor, not trying to say we support you and we don't support the other guys. We should be bringing to the political community in Canada, the United States, and around the world the best ideals for conservation and the conservation of wildlife and wildlands and all wildlife habitat, for clean waters, for a clean environment, for opportunities for people to enjoy the natural world. That's what we should be bringing to them, whether they call themselves Republicans, whether they call themselves Democrats or Liberals or Labour or whatever other label is placed on any of these political parties in any country, from South Africa to India to Russia to Ukraine to Slovenia to Peru to Chile to the United States of America or to Canada. And that is what got us here, right?
Right.
That is why we hunt today, because that community brought those ideals. Without them having brought those ideals, we wouldn't be having this podcast and torturing your audience, and nobody will be out there to this very day hunting. I can guarantee you
that they would not. And 2 podcasts ago, I brought up the fact, and you've just made it so clear that I think it's worth bringing up again, especially in juxtaposition of where we are sitting. Hunters are very proud of our heritage of funding conservation, and we have right here the state of Nevada. Their senator, Key Pittman, was a Democrat who put forth, due to his leadership, but yet his concern for what was happening on the landscape of people he listened to, he was the Democratic sponsor of the Pittman-Robertson Act in 1937. He went and found a Republican, Robertson, who has his own colorful history and is worth reading about. Together, they, with great risk to their political careers at a time in the 1930s of Great Depression and everything else.
Absolutely.
They brought forth an idea based on the fact that we want to lead. We believe in a greater ideal.
Ideals.
Not the idea of this is Republican or this is Democrat.
That's right.
And here we are, 80 years later, the beneficiaries of that leadership, of that commonality to say, how did you say it? Don't bring conservation down to politics, bring politics up to conservation.
Yes.
Perfect example. And our history in the United States is full of those examples of where we've benefited from that case. People are so much admire that leadership that just right out our window here is the Key Pittman wildlife area. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because at times, because I'm so involved and engaged in this, it's helpful to have context and perspective of not letting myself think the whole world's going to hell in a handcart. But I do worry about it, and I speak out on it, because I do not want to see hunting and conservation become this flip-flop, this seesaw, this back and forth of we make a little progress for 2 years and then we erase it. If we make a little progress for 2 years, I hope in 4 years we make even more progress, regardless of who is there.
Well, small steps forward are better than big steps backward and forward. I mean, let's face it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you put a little bit of money in your bank account each time, it will grow. But if you put a lot in and take a lot out, well, I mean, you end up with status quo.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with you. Absolutely.
Well, Shane, I know you and I both were here at this SHOT Show, and we both were pulled a million different ways, so we didn't get the headsets on as quickly as we would have liked. And I out of respect for a man as busy as you, I'm going to cut this one a little short. Do you have any things you want to leave the audience with, or that you want to leave me with? Or
well, the only thing is, I mean, I think we live in a time that demands the best of us. We're very blessed and extremely fortunate to live in the countries we live in, where wildlife is still abundant and where land is still abundant and where we still have the opportunities that we have. And it need not have been this way. It might not have been this way, and it need not be this way in the future. And unless we work, for those wild others that cannot speak for themselves, all of these traditions will end. It is not because the hunter is vocal or is passionate or is determined that is the ultimate arbiter of whether these traditions are maintained. It is whether there is wildlife out there and whether there is land to support the wildlife that it can exist. And if we lose sight of this in petty battles amongst ourselves or petty battles, with other sectors in society, then I think we only do a disservice to the wildlife that has given us so much. We have basically three problems facing the conservation world. One is that too few people care overall. And the second is that those people who do care are deeply divided and fighting amongst themselves. And the third issue is that we desperately need more money for the conservation of wildlife everywhere in the world. And part of the reason that we can't get this money is because governments recognize that too few people care and are not vocal enough about these issues, and those that are divided. And believe me, that often makes it extremely convenient for political parties to play one little piece off against the other. And I was in government for 30 years, so no one needs to tell me that this is not true.
Yeah.
So I wish you well, Randy, with all of your work, and I wish your listeners well, and I wish this country well.
Well, Shane, I cannot thank you enough. Your insight, your perspective, and your commitment to this bigger picture of conservation of all who care about wildlife and wild places and wild things is motivating to me. It always causes me to question myself. Am I doing what is best for all wildlife, all things, and all who care as much as I do about wildlife, even if they have a different life experience? So thank you very much. And folks, thanks for listening. And if you get a chance, go to conservationvisions.com. Vision or visions?
Visions, plural.
With an S. Okay. Conservationvisions.com. You will spend days and hours consuming and reading and listening to some remarkable work that Shane has done. So thanks for listening, folks. Thanks for listening, folks. Thanks for listening, folks. Thanks for listening, folks. Thanks for listening, folks.